higher education can be the best means, the most legitimate means of equalizing, and the most bloodless means. There have been other means of equalizing society in history, and usually they have tended to be not work out very well. On the other hand, and this is the paradoxical part, on the other hand, higher education is also the best means for maintaining the status quo. How does this happen? This happens in a way that should be familiar to us, at least in our country. It happens if you ensure that access to higher education is open to all in theory, but in practice is actually restricted to the old elite. If you ensure this, then higher education becomes a mode by which ascriptive privilege, by birth privilege, can be converted into merit privilege. Where you say that now, after having gone through this transformation, now I am where I am, not because of my caste, but because of my sheer merit. And it is pure coincidence that all the meritorious people happen to be from certain castes. So, this is a modernization of, and therefore a strengthening of caste privilege, because you have converted caste privilege into merit privilege by ensuring that there is an in practice equality of opportunity in the educational system. So, higher education can be simultaneously the best means of bringing about equality and the best means for maintaining inequality, modernizing and strengthening systems of inequality so that they can survive into the present era where the dominant ideologies are those of meritocracy and equality of opportunity. So, given that higher education is at this, occupies this critical space, and given therefore that we need to be very sensitive to forms of discrimination here, we come to the final leg of our journey, and that is to say, how does discrimination work in higher educational institutions? There are many different aspects to this. In order to put this very briefly, I will simply mention, it's like reading out headlines. I'll simply be reading out my headlines, and we can talk more about this in question and answer if you have questions. We do this especially in India, mostly, but now I'll restrict myself to India. We can also talk about other contexts if those interest you. We do this in India in a variety of ways. First of all, the higher education sector in India has some additional peculiarities, some additional peculiar features. To cut a long story short, I call this a distorted credential market. Normal markets are supposed to drive out substandard producers from the market. If you produce a substandard product, consumers are supposed to vote with their feet, not buy your product, so that in time period 1, 2, 3, especially by time period 3, you're out of business because nobody's buying your product. In higher education, we have a peculiar situation where institutions known to be producing substandard products, that is to say, higher educational institutions offering little or no training, nevertheless flourish. How do they flourish? They flourish because the requirement for the real requirement from such institutions is a legal credential, not competence. Because the legal credential is required for the transmission of privilege or property or from across generations. Very quickly, suppose I'm an architect, suppose I'm a lawyer, suppose I'm a doctor with a very well-established practice, and I need to pass it on to my son or daughter. My son or daughter needs to have a legal entitlement to practice that profession. And I'm confident that I can teach my son or daughter the real job, on the job. But initially, I need my son or daughter to actually have a piece of paper entitling him or her to practice medicine or architecture or law or whatever the case may be. So, even though I'm otherwise a very shrewd, worldly wise, very sharp consumer, when it comes to higher education, I'm willing to collude with the poor producer in order that my requirements, my specific requirements are met. So this is a distorted credential market because the need is really for a credential and not for the competence that the credential stands for, which you're confident because of your social status or your position that you can protect your wards, whoever your son or daughter, you can protect them from the consequences of the credential not being a true credential. That is to say, credential not signifying levels of competence that you that are presumed. So you will teach them on the job, you will protect them from the consequences of their incompetence and so on, if these should arise. Because of this, it's possible for these institutions to flourish. Therefore, even though we have had a tremendous expansion of the higher education sector, it's really staggering, and perhaps China and India together, this is the largest such instance in the shortest period in human history. The entry of first generation learners into the higher educational sector is huge. In our own country, between 1991 and 2013, for which the 13-14, for which the latest figures are available, our enrollment in higher education has gone up 6.5 times, the number of institutions has gone up by 4 times, and the gross enrollment ratio has gone up 3 times, from about 8 to about 24% during these 20 odd years. Our higher educational sector now is 323 lakh people, or 3.23 crores, which is more than the population of Australia, and is probably the largest, probably I say because statistics on this are not yet fully formed, the largest such sector in the world. Now, in the light of what I've been saying about higher education, this should be good news, but it isn't good news because this expansion has been accompanied by privatization and by a distortion of the distribution of disciplines and subjects for obvious reasons. The easily encashable disciplines, the professional types of colleges have expanded the most, and privatization has led to high costs and so on. So in short, despite a very welcome and very necessary expansion of higher education, it does not follow that equality of opportunity has been achieved purely through this kind of an expansion. Therefore, we come back to the question of discrimination. In the subsector of this expanding higher educational field, the subsector of public institutions, which is in relative terms shrinking all the time. Today, 65% of all enrollment is in private institutions. Roughly 75% of institutions are in the private sector. So we are constantly, the public sector is constantly shrinking in education. So in this sector, how does discrimination work? The point to start, the place to start talking about this is the very basis of the worldview within which ideas about discrimination are fitted. What do I mean by this? I mean by this, to begin with, the idea that we think of discrimination as an exception. The norm is meritocratic society. That the default setting of society we assume is meritocratic. And we think of discrimination as an aberration, as an exceptional, deviant behavior. In actual fact, in societies around the world, it is the opposite. Normal society is biased in the ways that it is biased in an almost natural way, because privilege begets privilege, and there are many reasons why the privilege, it's very hard to prevent the privileged from passing on their privilege to their next generations. So the default, what if you start thinking the other way? What if you start thinking that the default setting of society is actually not in favor of the equality of opportunity, and that therefore the task of institutions such as this is to, in a sense, be active rather than simply be passive. Why do I say this? I say this because if you adopt the other view, the dominant view, where you think of discrimination as the exception, then it becomes possible for institutions to, in a sense, what used to be called in the days of trade unionism, that is now very distant past because we have hardly any trade unions now, what's the name? But there used to be this tactic called work to rule, where you take advantage of the fact that it is usually very hard. It takes a lot of language, a lot of paper, and even then you can never fully describe a job, an action. So work to rule was when trade unions say we will do exactly what the rule says and nothing more. So, for example, a common tactic that used to be used, unloading is a task that is specified in the union contract. So they say, yeah, we are ready to unload, but it doesn't say you should take down the tailboard of the truck. The contract doesn't say that you should take down the tailboard of the truck. So we are not going to unload until somebody takes down the tailboard of every truck that comes in. Once you take down the tailboard, we will unload. Like this, you get what I mean, right? You follow it's impossible to specify. It takes a lot of language to try and do this. So work to rule can be done by, something similar can be done by institutions. If you are thinking in the mode where the default setting is meritocracy and discrimination is an aberration. Because then institutions can be passive, simply follow the rules and throw up their hands at the consequences. Such is life. Too bad. We have not done anything wrong. We are following all the rules. Right? So this in a country like India, for the reasons I've already mentioned you, given the critical importance of the higher education sector, is no longer enough. If ever it was enough, is no longer enough. So I am putting this in upfront in front of you. I'm stating this upfront that, for example, the trend in the US legislature, in the US judiciary, towards minimalist definitions of discrimination, towards requiring effectively identical treatment of all candidates. This trend will not work in a country like India. This is a claim I'm putting forward, we can discuss this. So in other words, for a normal institution in the public sector in higher education, for it to behave normally, not necessarily in an activist mode, even to behave normally requires it to be proactive rather than passive. Because following the rules and doing nothing more is set to ensure the reproduction of inequality. Okay, now suppose we make this change, we make this mental change, and we think of discrimination as the norm rather than the exception, and we are in a sense alert, we are well-intentioned, we are an institution, right? So how then do we look at the problem of discrimination? Once again, what is the opposite of discrimination? It helps to think like that. The opposite of discrimination is meritocracy. How do we measure? And that is where many of our problems lie. Our problems lie not in the fact that there is no such thing as merit and it's all fraud and so on. I don't believe in that. I think there is such a thing as merit. But on the other hand, we have a lot of problem with merit because of two main things. We are confused about measurement and we are confused about force. Measurement first. The common mode of measuring excellence or measuring merit as we call it, in our context, is rank in an examination. Now this idea enables or encourages, one can probably go even further, almost ensures a very fatal slippage from ideas about eligibility or minimum required levels of competence to ideas about excellence. Why? Because rank in an examination is a kind of a system that is designed to produce a hierarchy. That's what examinations produce, right? If they didn't, there would be a huge problem. It's hard to imagine, but as a logical thought experiment, just imagine what would happen if your, I'm forgetting what your exam is called, the law exam that you take to get admission into various law. Yeah, that examination. Suppose if it produced it produced a result where the top 8,000 people had the same mark. It's very hard to imagine that it would, right? But suppose it did. If it did, that exam would become useless. So in other words, what I'm trying to illustrate for you is that that exam is a device intended to produce inequality. That is intended to produce a graded hierarchy. That graded hierarchy is about selecting the best according to some particular idea of what the best involves, which is what is reflected hopefully in the examination. For admission to an educational institution, do we require the best? There is another kind of confusion that is happening here, a confusion between a rationing logic and an excellence logic. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the task of an educational institution is to add value, right? You go to an educational institution because you don't already know it all. If you already knew it all, why bother, right? You could just go directly to whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing. So in other words, you are unfinished and the institution is supposed to add value to you. So you're an apprentice, you're somebody who will learn more. Differential abilities to make the most out of such opportunities are a fact. When it is the task of an institution to add value, to teach you something, then it should be looking not at taking those who are excellent, but at ensuring that those who come in are competent for that level. In other words, what I'm saying is that instead of entry being based solely on rank in an examination, there is an argument for it to be based on multiple criteria. And it would be equally fair for such criteria to apply. The idea, the familiar idea that we think of anything that disturbs this single criterion as being unfair, anything else would be unfair, that comes from the confusions that I have talked about. The difference between eligibility and competence, and the difference between, competence and excellence, and the difference between a rationing logic. Most of the time, these ranked examinations are a device for rationing. The number of places is much smaller than the number of applicants. A socially legitimate reason has to be given for saying no to very large numbers, and the examination provides this socially legitimate reason to say no. Well and good so far. What if you think of this educational institution as a resource? I have just argued before you that they are precisely resources. Higher education is precisely such a resource that provides access to social mobility. Should we then have what is effectively a first past the post kind of logic here, where whoever gets more ought to get all of whatever is available? Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't work. So let me very quickly give you this logic. By the logic of the examination, the logic that you often hear being used against things like reservation, where, for example, the popular thing, would you want your plane to be flown by a reservation candidate sort of logic? By that logic, if you think about it, for every batch, there should be only one pilot. Because everyone else, whoever tops, everyone else is less than that, right? So there is no real justification, because otherwise everyone has passed the examination and that examination certifies that they are competent. But that is not enough for you. You want the best. If you want the best, there is only one, by this logic. So everyone who does not come first should just give up. It doesn't work, this logic doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Why do we agree that other people are also competent even though they didn't come first? Because we are thinking not of excellence as decided through this method, but we are thinking of levels of competence. So at the intake level, what an educational institution should worry about, and this is also where we have fudged on this also. So I accept the fact that it's not as though this has not been fudged sometimes. But this is where we should hold it rigid, where there should be absolutely no compromise. The minimum levels of competence should be decided upon honestly. That is to say, it should represent a level below which a person simply cannot handle the course, whatever the course is. Right? This should be honestly determined. Once this is honestly determined, we should hold on to this. But after that, everybody who is above this level belongs to a pool with a claim, with a certain kind of entitlement to the higher educational institution. How are we to adjudicate between these within this pool? Because this pool is likely to be much larger than the number of places available. Right? Here, it need not be only rank in an examination. We can bring in other considerations because of the importance of higher education as an equalizing force. So, for example, we can bring in gender, we can bring in all whatever we think causes inequality in our society, that can at this point be brought in as one of the considerations, an additional consideration for allocation of places. Remember, in the context, in most contexts actually, examinations are proxies. They are not really measuring that which they stand for, because it's very hard to measure that which they stand for, right? Your examinations are supposed to measure how good a lawyer you will be. Now that is a nebulous thing. It's very hard actually to measure. Examinations are the best we can do. Just because they are the best we can do, we should not confuse what they stand for. They are imperfect mechanisms. And to place faith on third decimal place differences for this kind of a thing is not rational. At the same time, there is enormous pressure because of the rationing logic. And that's why there is ideologically a huge investment in our context in meritocracy. Okay, I continually am talking about the taken for granted aspects that surround the issue of discrimination, because precisely these aspects are left untouched or not looked at. Against this background, if we now come back to the question of discrimination, we will come up with situations where what should an institution do? This is a question I face myself actually every day as a teacher, increasingly as our classrooms become more and more unequal. If you face an unequal classroom in the sense that people have come in with very different kinds of levels of training and so on, how defensible is it to offer an identical treatment, so to speak, or identical, if my output is identical with respect to all these students? Is this, in fact, from an institutional point of view, defensible? So I'm actually, in a sense, going 2 steps forward. I'm not even talking so far about actual cases of discrimination. That is to say, where the normal working of the institution is vitiated in order to injure or harm the interests of some particular segment, whether it is women, whether it is particular caste, or any other, it could be any other category as well, right? I'm talking about the default position of the institution. I'm arguing that the default position itself needs to be discerning, needs to, in this sense, in the original sense of the English word discriminate, needs to discriminate. Discriminate in the sense that a music connoisseur discriminates, right? Where you distinguish between different kinds of performances for a legitimate reason. So, when we come to institutional discrimination, it's very hard to talk about it in the abstract. So, cases like those of Rohit Vemula come up and they provide instances where concrete things can be taken up. But in general, what I'm trying to point out to you is that the framework within which we think of discrimination is already, in a sense, the normal framework with which we work, the unthinking framework with which we work, which we receive from society. It's not our fault. Discrimination does not require bad people. It does not require evil intention, does not require a conspiracy, particularly institutional discrimination. It can work very well in an impersonal way where everyone is very sincere and is in fact has the best of intentions, right? And yet the outcome can be, in a systematic sense, discriminatory. If we are aware of this, that's my argument essentially. If we are aware that this is the case, then as institutions, as public institutions, it becomes our duty to not have a standardized or not insist on the US Supreme Court sort of version of identical treatment to all as the only possible remedy. So in instances like those of Rohit Vemula and so on, we can get into the concrete aspects of it. What could the institution have done differently that might have had a different outcome? Otherwise, in the abstract, it's hard to talk about these things. So therefore, I'm leaving this at this point. But this is what I really wanted you to think about. A lot of the discussion of discrimination involves delimitation. Delimiting the relevant area, delimiting the area where the idea of discrimination makes sense. In every society in the world, we tolerate huge injustices, inequalities, and so on outside areas, delimited areas. Right? So, what happens if you're aware of the existence of inequality outside of that area, and yet you're aware that there is a delimitation? I started by saying that an institution is delimited from the rest of society. You're not coterminous with the rest of society. So we know that in the rest of the world, in almost every country in the world, very, very few, there are some Scandinavian perhaps exceptions. In every country in the world, for example, economic inequality is normalized. It is taken as normal. So that is not within the purview, it does not become discrimination. The poor are discriminated against, but that's just life. It's not called, it's hard to name it as discrimination. What I'm saying is that if we have very high stakes in public institutions of higher education, and if these institutions are meant to educate, meant to add value, rather than, say, the context of jobs, or rather than products. These are, students are sort of intermediate products, right? Your output is actually going to come after you leave this institution. So the output of an educational institution is the input for other institutions in society. So for institutions like this, it is necessary to think differently, to think more proactively and more, one could even use this word, more aggressively about passive forms of discrimination without even opening up the whole issue of really existing discriminations, where even by the existing rules, there are fouls are being committed, so to speak. So in effect, I'm inviting you to think about frameworks of delimitation. When we speak of discrimination, how are we marking out the boundaries of the space within which we will consider meaning, in which for us the idea of discrimination will make sense. I'll stop here and wait for your questions.
Any questions, comments, or suggestions?
are any of you involved with there are these efforts to design a comprehensive law, anti-discrimination law? Are any of you involved with that? I believe there are many legal groups that are working on this. Anybody know anything about this?
Nobody wants to work. When you are allowed to speak, that is enough. I was not allowed to speak even when I was teaching in the university. My students always used to fight with me that why I am supporting the idea of positive action for removing the existing discriminations in the society. Of course, now they remember me for that, but I don't know. But there has been a resistance to this because even within families, it's very difficult to actually transfer this idea, or it's not that easy. Because it seems it's very normal. What is abnormal about it?
I keep stressing this self-interest. It's in our self-interest to reduce inequality somewhat, because we won't be able to keep whatever little we have if we don't do something about this actively. So it's pure self-interest, if you like. And now, in recent times, even institutions like the World Bank are discovering that the rich do better in countries with less inequality. So, you know, even from the point of view of the quality of life. So I am. It's not an altruistic argument for me at all. I mean, I'm worried about what I have and being able to keep it. And it's for that we need, because the kind of inequalities we have with democracy, nobody else has. South Africa had those inequalities, but then they had apartheid, they had a semi-military regime. Yes.
So how can we change the society to the ideology of a certain society who always encourages discrimination? Because right now we see that education is the only tool by which we can change the society. But if we see the recent example like P.L. Punia, he is an IAS officer, he is well educated. But if he is only getting discriminated in a temple and society doesn't help him, so do you think that there is a kind of a change in the educational institution to...
Well, this meeting is happening.
Sir, but...
So I think it's very important. You see the...
Like sir, if you are well educated and then also you are getting discriminated, then what's the use of that?
No, there are two parts to this. My answer to you will have two parts. First is, discrimination is not only negative discrimination. For the vast majority of us in this room, we have been discriminated in favor of. So it's a very painful idea. If you are an honest person, it's a painful idea to think that everything that you have may not entirely be due to your own personal merit. When you entertain that idea, it kind of, the ground shakes under you and your moral universe is disturbed. But it is a factually the probability of this being true is very, very high. I mean, there is no more tactful way I can put it. So, to begin with, entertain that idea. Think about it. What if you question, in all honesty, the idea that everything that you have got is due solely to your merit? Once again, remember, I'm not claiming that there is no such thing as merit. Obviously, you worked hard, but so do others. Right? So, if you factor in that, because discrimination is not only the negative kind, it's because there is discrimination of the positive kind that the negative kind becomes relevant. So we start, the second part of this is, much of the time discrimination works because it is not visible as discrimination. The most durable forms of discrimination are practiced by the most well-intentioned people, because they are not even aware that this is discrimination. Right? There were many things, for example, relatively less controversial, though that may not always be true. Example to take is that of women. If you go back 30 years, 40 years, not ancient history, even 20 years ago, what it was considered proper for a woman to do, there were very different ideas. You go back 40 years, again very different ideas. And these were held in all sincerity. They were not bad people who held these ideas. So my point is, the second thing you can do, the first thing is, first of all, be aware of whether you are being positive, you are benefiting from discrimination. Second is, learn to name discrimination. Because the starting point is when it is named as discrimination. Because when it is working, when it is normalized, it sinks below the threshold of notice. That's why it continues. That's why it flourishes. So it's a very big task to name discrimination as discrimination. And that is the reason why Rohit Memula's letter captured so many minds. Because it conveyed without saying, without complaining, without using the normal sort of language that these are my 4 grievances and so on. It conveyed the feeling of being left out. And this feeling was conveyed in a language that we recognized as ours. That's what got so many people, affected so many people. I've never seen so much poetry being written on the net, than in response to this. So he was able to name it in a particular way. It's tragic that was one of the last things he did, but that is one of the things we can do. We can name discrimination where it has not so far been visible. So here are 2 things to do. Society is a very big thing. Nobody's ever met society, right? We don't know what it is. So we should start small around you, and there is plenty to do even in the delimited circumstances that we live in.
Okay.
For dealing discrimination, we have to work on the root issue. So, as per your remark about the higher education, so don't you think before going to the entrance examination pattern, we need to improvise our primary or secondary education service throughout the India, so that the discrimination on the ground level is becomes solely on the basis of education provided to everyone, so that there should not much work to do on the higher level.
Yes. Should we collect questions? Okay, I'll take it since we're taking them one by one. Absolutely, this is a standard issue that comes up. We have to, one of the biggest tragedies of post-independence India is what happened to the school education system starting from the decade of the 70s. It is my generation that was probably the first to be sent to private schools. My parents' generation went to government schools and they did not suffer for that. And yet now, probably the most robust indicator of socioeconomic status is whether your children go to a normal government school. So yes, absolutely, that is right. But that is not a substitute for addressing higher education. We need to do both. And in fact, that is one of the things that, there are many other features of higher education that single it out. One of the features is this, that because it is a downstream sector, it has to deal with the accumulated deficits of the earlier sectors, and which often places it in an impossible situation. So often you find teachers throwing up their hands and saying, how can we compensate for 12 years of schooling and 3 years of an undergraduate education and so on. Yes, true. But we have reached the stage today where we have to break down the older hierarchies. One of the big problems in our education system has been that the higher levels are not responsible for the lower levels. So we have to begin to now take an active interest in the lower levels. We will be forced to, again out of sheer self-interest, and already I can see that beginning to happen. So yes, we have to address. That is where things start, but that is not a substitute for also addressing, also acting at the higher educational level. And maybe the innovative change that is coming in the near future is going to be the more active involvement of higher education in lower levels, or earlier levels of education.
Sir.
I would like to have your view as a sociologist on one of the issues. One of the things which we know otherwise, that if you just add up the groups or the subgroups which are claiming affirmative action, that will at any given point of time will hugely outnumber the people who are not entitled to those rights. But over a period of time, what we are realizing that there's so much of fragmented groups which are claiming, and so much so that this has also become a competitive issue. Competition with respect to getting benefits of affirmative action. And what it has resulted into precisely a situation with which you are talking about, which you were talking about, that it allows states to be a passive state. You say that, oh, there are so many set of the people, there are so many issues, let there be a status quo. So what are the sociological reasons and what are the possibilities you see out from this guide?
Yes, this is again something that I work on, so there is a risk of talking too much on this, so I'll try and keep this brief. You're absolutely right. Reservation is, in our context, reservation is both an idea that is a very large idea, as well as a concrete, actual policy. It works on both ways, in both ways. The idea of reservation is a very, very large one, and it pervades our society. And the word reservation is simply a code for accessing that idea, which has actually no relation to the actual concrete policy. So what I'm saying is that the concrete policy of reservation has almost reached a dead end now. But that the danger that we face is that because of this dead end being reached, the idea of reservation, what reservation actually stood for, is in danger of being undermined, because that idea is more important than ever before. What was the original idea of reservation? When reservations first came about via the Pune Pact of 1932 and so on, where the logic was absolutely not that of backwardness or compensating for the backwardness or disadvantage of any community. It was for ensuring citizenship, because a modern nation state is supposed to involve a people who are marked by equality, at least in principle, not in practice, in principle. Whereas in our country, as a caste society, we had in principle inequality, de jure inequality. And in order to address that, and therefore our claim to be a nation was not credible. And it is in order to address that claim that reservation came in, and at that time it was only for representation. So the original idea of reservation was to ensure citizenship, ensure the inclusion of those who were excluded by law, by caste law. So in other words, forcible inclusion was the answer to forcible exclusion. After that, we have had a variation on that, where the ideas of disadvantage were also brought in. Right? And slowly that started a spectrum, a never-ending kind of spectrum where there was no end. The idea of inclusion remains absolutely central to our society. We have to protect that idea. And for these scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, reservation is the format that ensures inclusion. And that is necessary. What has happened is what is referred to as politicization and so on, where it is being treated as a benefit, as a welfare program. Because after all, if to the extent that reservation is supposed to deal with discrimination, it is not about the lower caste at all. After all, who discriminates? It's the upper caste who discriminate. So reservation is the answer to an upper caste problem. It is not intended to make up for the disadvantage. That is unfortunately the language in which we have got trapped in. Because we have got trapped in that language, all kinds of groups whose claim to inclusion, there's no issue there. They have always been included. And in fact, not just included, they have actually occupied dominant positions in society. Because of the slide from inclusion to disadvantage, these groups try to claim that language, and so we are in this anomalous position where the same, ostensibly the same word or the same concrete policy is being claimed by groups which have no standing when it comes to the question of inclusion. So we need to, there are excellent arguments against reservation for groups like say Jats or Patidars. Those arguments are not arguments against reservation as such, because reservation as such is fundamentally about the idea of inclusion, and there continue to be groups that are excluded from society. And reservation in that sense, in the foundational sense that I'm talking about of inclusion, should continue as long as atrocities continue. Because atrocities are the other side of the picture that show us that there is this kind of distinction still operating in our society. But yes, it has become an intractable problem because of the slide from inclusion to disadvantage. Because there is no end to disadvantage. Everybody is disadvantaged relative to somebody else. And there is also, in terms of sheer economic logic, no need to go into the details, but there are calculations which show that even if reservation were to be introduced into the private sector, it would affect at best 2.5% of all jobs. This is not as small as it sounds because our entire formal sector is 6%. So 2.5% of 6% is a significant thing. Nevertheless, it is 2.5%, and you cannot build a future on anything, any policy that is going to affect only 2.5% of the population. So in other words, as a concrete policy, job reservation has no future, in my opinion. The problem with reservation in terms of its foundational idea of inclusion is that we need to do much more than just reservation. That's the problem. It's too little, not too much. For certain other groups, they should never be in the discussion in the first place. But this is our problem. We have allowed the sliding from one to the other happen, and it's very hard now to recover lost ground and to remind people of what reservation is actually meant to be about.
So in that sense, the other side which I was interested in, I specifically pointed out your view as a sociologist. Coming from a tradition of a sociologist, not necessarily of the same idea, where the idea was that every group's claim makes a claim over a claim which is a claim of a higher caste. That is sensitization and all this kind of idea. Whereas you see a situation where everybody is claiming that no, we are not that, we are more than what you are thinking.
Yes, but the curious thing, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
So in that sense, don't you see that there is a drastic social shift which is happening? That no longer you are getting, say, marked just because of the fact that you don't belong to a sensitized class. There is no such disincentive. So in that sense,
Yes.
Don't you think it has created some kind of equality in the sense that the whole idea of delegitimization just because of the fact that you don't go through all those sacred steps and all that?
I would say yes and no. The interesting thing for me is that these claims to backwardness, the claims to backwardness on the part of communities which are in an empirical sense forward, my argument is that it is precisely these communities which can afford to make the claim for reservation as backward, because they know that they will not allow anyone to treat them as socially inferior. Jats can do this because Jats are a dominant community in Haryana, and they will not allow anybody to treat them as though they belong to reserved category, normally what reserved category is called. So typically, Patidars, same thing. It is precisely, or Kapus, same thing. It is precisely the communities which have the social power to ensure that they are not treated as socially inferior who can dare to ask for this. Communities which run, it's like the other thing that Mahatma Gandhi could afford to dress like that because everybody knew he was Mahatma Gandhi. Right? An ordinary person who dresses like that, that dress would not produce the same effect. So in the same way, if a truly socially vulnerable community asks for this, then they run the risk of being treated like that. Whereas these communities don't. And that's why they feel emboldened to ask for this. And claiming backwardness in this sense is exactly the same as claiming to be poorer than you are when you file your tax return. It's a very, very common thing. Rich people, it's considered good to be richer. There's no doubt about that. And yet, when we file tax returns, people try to claim they're poorer than they are because it gets some benefit. So in the same way, you're claiming backwardness completely strategically. There is not for a moment are you thinking that you are socially inferior to anybody. And it's as a mark of your assertion that you are able to do this. You are able to capture. In the same way that powerful groups capture the APL cards. It's not that nobody will treat them as poor. They will ensure that that will not happen. So that's my point is really that it's not so much that it's now okay to be backward, but it's a mark of privilege to be able to claim this benefit also from the state, and you have the power to bend the state, to give it to you, no matter of what the evidence is, no matter what the rules say.
Since you are short of time, we invite 2 more questions. It is Anshul and
So my question is, your views on education institutes that are set up and maintained by religious groups or minorities.
Yes. See, you have to go on a case-by-case basis. There is no general argument against religious institutions.
Like AMU case, that's.
So you have to understand what is meant by minority status, what is at stake in minority status, things like that, right? So where there is a case for this is where some kind of religious instruction is actually imparted, where the interests of some particular minority are in fact protected or taken care of. There may be some case to be made, but as I say, this has to be from a specific case by case. I think for large universities there are different points of view. For large universities like Jamia and AMU and so on, I don't know if I personally don't know if any particular purpose is served by keeping them as minority institutions. The same may not be true of smaller institutions somewhere else, where there may be a logic to keeping them as minority institutions. So for public universities, as long as there is nothing hangs upon it, I think it's fine if it's not a big problem if AMU or Jamia is no longer considered a minority institution. That's my personal view. Yes.
Sir, we have, say, for example, around 197 nations or countries in the world. And I love to imagine it as an opportunity for the societies, let's say each country is a society, to come up with its own sort of arrangements, its own sort of models, to realize this common goal, what we say, that every society wants to be egalitarian, a peaceful society, a good idea of having beautiful time, good time on earth. And we have, say for example, 197 models of these arrangements. Let's take example of India. We are a constitutional democracy. Preamble says something. Say we are justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. And look at Article 39 B and C. It says, okay, common resources have to be used to the common, should not be used to the common detriment. And operation of economic systems should be such that benefits goes to all, not to a particular section of group or like that. But reality is totally different. And I was reading few days back Thomas Piketty, French philosopher and economist. So,
not yet a philosopher.
Okay, economist. So Piketty seems to be arguing what lies at the heart of his research is that you go to any nation, you will find there is this particular 1-2% of population that have 98% of wealth. So this forces me to think, is inequality, discrimination inherent thing of humans? Because these are some things which do not know the boundaries, be it French, be it Indian, be it Britishers, be it. So I just keep on wondering about this. Why is it so?
Yes. You done?
Yeah, I'm done. I have other part of question that I will ask later.
Okay.
See.
Yeah, okay, we need to finish quickly. Okay. See, the point about Pigott's work is that this was not always so. That's the whole point. That such inequalities have been increasing the world over in the last 30-40 years. That's his point. Earlier, these inequalities were much less. So it was possible, and USA remained USA. All the countries remained what they were. No earthquake came, nothing. It was perfectly possible to survive as a society, and in fact flourish without these levels of inequality. Whereas today, this is the global trend. That's what his research is pointing out. So in that sense, inequality is not a fact of nature, because it wasn't true before.
So
Right.
on one hand we say we are progressing towards constitutionalism, more rule of law, more egalitarian path. On the other hand we are saying okay, inequality is increasing. So it's a clear sort of paradox, contradiction. that
Yes,
you're
but
talking about.
it is a man-made inequality. No? It's not like the law of gravity or anything like that. So if it is man-made, it can be unmade. And there are specific policies that can be followed to reduce. And in fact, he's advocating. He told Indian government to tax more because the rates of taxation here are less than even advanced Western countries. So in other words, this is a created situation. Not in the sense of a conspiracy, but it is a consequence of identifiable actions. And in that sense, there is no larger, supernatural force at work or anything like that. And given that it is created through particular sets of policies, it can also be pushed back a little. The idea of full equality is in any case utopia. That's not the point. The point is to have sustainable levels of inequality. The levels of inequality we have are not sustainable, at least not sustainable at the same time as being a democracy. That's basically the point, and that is the point that Pigott is also making.
Thank you, sir. I'll now invite Professor M.P. Singh sir to continue.
I think this sort of thing should be avoided. This was supposed to be an informal talk.
It is simply books and the preamble of the Constitution which and the Constitution, actually it has been excellent talk, and
I thought this was a memento.
I must take it. Yes, it is memento. I congratulate you for actually having thought of it, although we have been getting scholars from different disciplines. It's a great thing that knowing that Professor Deshpande has been writing about equality, that we thought of inviting him today here. I need not make any long comments on it because his a rounded, I think, presentation has been excellent. It could not be better. But just to add a little bit, that not only these divisions are being created and strengthened, which, as he said during his father's time, I am not of his father's age, but maybe close to it. I am from that system when hardly there were private schools. We all had the same kinds of schools. In the villages, of course, the position was bad, but in the city all the schools were of similar type. And we could also survive, we could also work, so it's not that. So there is a famous statement from Dworkin, because you study jurisprudence, and one is that an equal society is always better than an unequal society.
Dworkin was considered to be a new Kantian. Kant was also of the opinion, however, that whatever you do, society cannot be equal in every respect. Human beings can't be equal in every respect. So when we are talking of equality, actually we are talking of what Dworkin says of equal respect, or actually treating every man or human being as a unit in himself or herself, and giving him or her that respect which as an individual one deserves. Actually, the kind of discriminations that exist in our society, they are actually of very stark nature, where we have not considered and we continue not to consider large number of people as human beings. And that is really a grave challenge before us, which has to be removed. The constitution makers have tried to do that. Some efforts have also been made in that direction, but we should not get diverted. And in the institutions actually where we are supposed to teach constitution and constitutional values, we should try to understand those values and promote them. I'm glad that those values are coming from a sociologist, and sociologists actually are great supporters of law, because law has to stand on the foundations of sociology as well as economics you mentioned. But these are some of the things which the academic institutions like this one, where you have all the opportunity to change the society, you should also think of it more seriously, along with all other courses which you study for day-to-day life. There is no doubt that you will live a good life, but also think of creating a good society where you can live a better life. Life will be much more secure for every one of us if there is greater equality in this society. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for giving us